Hello everyone, welcome to this channel. Our channel narrates the life stories of our viewers from all around the world. To protect individuals' privacy, names are sometimes altered in these stories. The hardest part of my life was trust. Maybe if it hadn't been broken when I was a kid, I wouldn't be so afraid now. And maybe I'd have a better life. My dad worked in a factory, and while we weren't poor, we weren't rich either. My mom was often impatient, and she wasn't very keen on taking care of kids, and my dad was the same way. They treated me normally, but they didn't pay much attention to a lot of things. Things that, if noticed, might have saved me and prevented my life from falling apart. On normal days during my childhood, when I really wanted someone to play with me, no one would. One day, I went to my mom with a new toy my dad had bought for me, asking her to play. She had her head buried in a notebook, clearly working. Both my parents worked, and whenever I'd go to either of them, they say they didn't have time to play. This happened so many times that I eventually stopped asking. I spent most of my time in my room and rarely went outside. No one really checked on me, as if my isolation was more convenient for them. When I started school, no one paid much attention to my studies. They cared about my grades but didn't help me learn how to get good ones. I struggled with math, and they would always scold me for it. But it wasn't intentional. I wanted to do well, but didn't know how. One day, after getting a failing grade in math, I nervously handed my test paper to my mom. She frowned at it and finally said, "Dorsa, you'll never amount to anything like this." She always said that to me. At first, it didn't matter much, but over time, those simple words started to hurt deeply. It was as if I had truly accepted that I was dumb and would never have a bright future. I became scared to show her my test papers. I would hide them just to avoid hearing those words again and again or getting punished. One day, when I came back home from school, I found a new person in our house. He was sitting with my parents, talking and laughing. When my parents saw me, they didn't react much. But that man, he was really friendly. He even invited me to sit next to him. It was the first time that anyone had been so warm to me. At first, I was scared to approach him and just stood there. Because I was silent and standing still there, my mom scolded me, "Dorsa, don't be rude. Come here." With my mom's words, I reluctantly went over and sat next to him. He looked me over from my hair to my toes and complimented everything. But when I didn't go to him right away, my mom gave me a harsh look, like I'd have to answer for it later once he was gone. He didn't let me go to my room, and even when my mom told me to go, he held me tight in his arms and said I had to stay with him. I only caught his last name, Khiyabani, from their conversation. At first, I had a bad feeling about him, but he was so kind that I wanted to talk to him more. They were talking about work, and I didn't understand any of it. But I did gather that Mr. Khiyabani owned the factory where my dad worked, and my mom was his accountant. That's about all I picked up. Mr. Khiyabani soon left, and my mom forgot to scold me about my grades. As soon as she was distracted, I quietly slipped away to my room so she wouldn't remember what I'd done. A few days later, one night while I was in my room, my mom came in and told me a few things, as she put it, just to make things clear. We were having guests that night, and Mr. Khiyabani and his family were coming over. She told me to make sure I greeted them properly and not to stare at them like a deer in headlights when they asked me to come over. To be honest, I was a little excited to see Mr. Khiyabani again because he was the only person who seemed to like me. That night, when they arrived, I quickly came out of my room so he could see me. As expected, he was just as warm as the first time, and even his wife treated me well. They had a son, a bit taller than me, who quietly watched me. His wife paid a lot of attention to me and eventually asked me to take their son Sohail to my room to play. Sohail was a bit quiet and shy, like me. When we got to my room, he didn't touch anything at first. I didn't know how to connect with him, so I just dumped out my toys and told him to play with them. But gradually he loosened up and started talking more. He realized that I wasn't very social. He invented games and then invited me to join in. We had a great time together then. And just one night, Sohail and I became such good friends that when they were about to leave, we didn't want to be apart. Sohail was crying and didn't want to go, and this made everyone else laugh. One day, while I was walking alone to school, I saw Sohail and his father. Sohail's father approached me warmly and patted my head. He asked, "Why are you alone, my dear? Do you always come by yourself?" I nodded, and he smiled and took my hand. From that day on, every day Sohail's father would pick me up along with his son and take both of us to school. One night, when Mr. Khiabani and his family were at our house again, my mom remembered that I had a math exam that day. I was frozen and stressed. I had scored poorly, and when I handed the paper to my mom, she yelled at me in front of everyone and repeated her usual scolding. I was so embarrassed in front of all of those people. I didn't want others to know I was struggling with my studies. But Mr. Khiabani's wife laughed and told my mom that school isn't that important to humiliate me in front of everyone. She asked my mom how many hours a day she spent helping me study and if she had ever asked my school about my shoes. My mom's answer was no, never. She had never even visited my school. Mr. Khiabani's wife, Parastu, asked my mom for permission for me to spend a few hours a day at their house. Our homes were pretty close, so I could walk there. Even though I was humiliated at night, it turned out well in the end. I got some distance from my family. Everything was going well until one day when Mr. Khiabani came to pick me up, but his son wasn't with him. He said that Sohail was sick and couldn't come, but he came just for me. It felt good that he came all the way just for me. But the path we were taking wasn't the way to school. We were passing through alleys, and we had been walking for a while. I was scared. We had gone too far, until finally he stopped in a dead-end alley. He knelt in front of me and said, "Oh, my little girl, your uncle is sick. I need to do something to feel better." I was surprised by what he said. How could I possibly help him? Without answering my questions, he started doing some things. I didn't know what he was doing, but I must say, as a child, the things he did made me feel ashamed. I tried to pull myself together, but I was scared and on the verge of tears. I felt a sharp pain in my body and I started crying. I didn't know what he was doing, but I didn't feel good about him anymore. He quickly straightened my clothes, and as we were heading to school, he said, "You mustn't tell anyone about this, okay? It's a secret between us. If your mom finds out, she will get mad at you. Very mad. Your dad too." His words had a strong effect on me. Since I was scared of my family, even if he hadn't said anything, I wouldn't have been able to tell them. I would get scolded for showing them a normal grade, let alone telling them what Mr. Khiabani had done. So I just blamed myself. On my way back from school, he came to pick me up again. I was scared of him, scared that he might do the same things again. My hands were sweaty from stress as long as I held his hand, but luckily that day he didn't do anything and he dropped me off at home. That day's evening, I had to meet Paraistu to study together. My mom insisted that I go, but I didn't want to. I kept feeling that maybe Paraistu would be like her husband too, but I didn't have the strength to argue with my mom. So before I knew it, I was inside their house, sitting in front of Paraistu with my books. Mr. Khiabani wasn't there, which made me feel a bit relieved. Suhail was sitting next to me, and both of us were carefully listening to his mother. That day, I learned the basics from Paraistu. Things that seemed very hard to me before became easy after that day. After studying, they wouldn't let me leave. They kept delaying until Mr. Khiabani arrived. As soon as he came in, my whole body filled with anxiety and stress again. But he looked at me with the same gaze he had before when he did those things. I pulled myself together and adjusted my skirt. After dinner, Mr. Khiabani offered to take me home, but I didn't want to. I was scared to be alone with him. I insisted they call my mom to come get me. So Paraistu called my mom to ease my mind. But no one answered. Then I asked them to call my dad, but he didn't answer either. Reluctantly, I had to go back with Mr. Khiabani. It was dark and there were few people on the street. He pulled me towards an alley and started again. I was trembling with fear and I didn't want to experience the pain I felt last time. I burst into tears, but he didn't care. His gaze had changed and he was so caught up in his own pleasure that he didn't think about the pain he was causing me. He did the same things again and emphasized that I shouldn't tell anyone. When we got home, my eyes were red. When my mom saw me, she asked, "Why were you crying?" I looked at her with fear and said nothing. A part of me wanted to tell her, but I knew she would scold me. I just said, "I wasn't crying, Mom," and quickly went to my room. I was scared of seeing Mr. Khiabani again. I was afraid of being alone with him. Every day when he took me to school, I felt tormented. I had lost all focus on my life. One day, while I was drying in my room, my mom called me. Even hearing my mom call my name made me scared, thinking she was going to send me to the Khiabani's house. And that's exactly what happened. She told me to get ready because Mr. Khiabani was coming to pick me up, and I wouldn't be coming back home that night because his son would be alone tonight. I froze. I went to my mom and said, "Mom, I don't want to go." My mom frowned at me and, surprised and angry, said, "What do you mean that you don't want to go? Dorsa, Mr. Khiabani likes you so much. He does so much for you. It would be disrespectful to refuse his request. It would embarrass us too. It's just one night. Be here with it. I'll come get you in the morning. Sohail's mom isn't at home. Sohail is alone tonight. They need you." Even Paraistu wouldn't be there for me to take refuge with. The situation became scarier for me. I no longer had the courage to argue with my mom because I knew if I kept it up, she would scold me again. But I also didn't have the courage to go to the Khiabani's house. I knew what he wanted to do. I was stuck between two paths, neither of which I could choose myself. They were chosen by the adults around me. Adults who, despite my young age, I understood more than they did. Yet none of them noticed the things I was aware of. When the doorbell rang, I panicked. Mr. Khiabani was waiting for me with his usual smile. His smile was no longer sweet and safe to me. I was looking for any way to escape from him. Reluctantly, I went with him to his house, but along the way I was holding back the tears. I decided not to leave Sohail's side at all that night. I wouldn't go anywhere away from Sohail, not even when he went to the bathroom. I waited outside the bathroom door in fear, knocking every few seconds for him to come out. When we entered in his room, I closed the door and nervously played. Mr. Khiabani set up a table in Sohail's room and we ate dinner together. But he kept looking at me. Every spoonful I took, my hand trembled. After the dinner, Sohail was very sleepy. I shook his hand and said, "Sohail, please don't sleep. Let's play, okay?" Sohail, surprised by my behavior, agreed. But his father soon came in and said Sohail had to sleep and that he had set up a bed for me in the living room. Hearing this, I quickly said, No, I want to stay with Sohail." Sohail silently looked and Khiabani came up with excuses to convince me to sleep in the living room, and he succeeded. I was just a kid then. I couldn't argue much and feared he would scold me. I spent hours under the blanket trembling. Suddenly a hand came over the blanket and pulled it aside. It was Mr. Khiabani. My nightmare was becoming a reality. His eyes were red and he moved his head closer. Large bats were flying around him, making noises. His face looked scarier than ever. I screamed and woke up, gasping for breath. When I woke up, I saw Mr. Khiabani beside me. I remembered the nightmare I had, and I was even more scared of him. I kept looking around to make sure there were no bats. He took my hand and said, "Dorsa, are you okay? Come sleep with me. You'll be scared if you stay here alone." I quickly pulled my hand away and stuttered. No, I'm fine here." He grabbed my hand again and said, "But you're scared. Let's go to my room so you won't be alone." He got up and started pulling me along with him. I resisted, but I wasn't strong enough. I cried and told him I didn't want to go with him, but he didn't listen. When I resisted more, his anger started showing in his actions. He pulled me roughly towards the room, dragging me behind him. Along the way, I kept hitting his arm with my fist, but it didn't help. He threw me into the room and locked the door behind him. When he turned back to look at me, I saw a different expression in his eyes. He was angry and frowning. I was even more scared of his frown. I slowly backed away and he pointed a finger at me threateningly, saying, "If you make a sound or say anything, you know what will happen." He glanced outside, then closed and locked the door again. He quickly came towards me, lifted me off the ground and threw me onto the bed. I was crying silently. I wasn't strong enough to stop him. I was much smaller compared to him, not even the size of his leg. He did strange things. He had a piece of ice in his hand. I was crying out in pain. In the end, I screamed so much that he covered my mouth with a cloth. After that, no sound came out of me anymore. My hands were tied so I wouldn't move, and after he was finished, he united them. I was crying while trying to put on my clothes, but he didn't let me. He threw my clothes to the corner. I backed away and held my hands in front of me. Seeing that, he seemed to enjoy it more because he lay down and said that I should come towards him. Reluctantly, I went towards him. If I resisted, he would pull me closer. I was just crying and trembling. At the crack of dawn, he told me to put my clothes on. While I was getting dressed, he started again and a sharp pain spread through my body. I had become numb and didn't even cry anymore. I was just sad. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I stayed awake out of fear, and Mr. Khiabani was awake too, enjoying himself. In the morning, I kept asking him to call my mom, but he didn't listen and said he would take me himself. I didn't move away from Sohail. When Sohail went to the bathroom, he grabbed my hand and pulled me towards him. He looked at me with a frown and harshly said, "When I say I'll take you myself, you say yes, sir. Don't be so obvious in front of others." It was the first time I saw this side of him. It was like he was just pretending to be nice. I was holding back tears and didn't say anything, but I didn't give in. As soon as Sohail came back, I kept asking him to call my mom. Finally, he gave in and agreed to call. I was so happy, but after 5 rings, no one answered. Tears welled up in my eyes. Sohail looked at me, crying with surprise, and laughed. Dorsa, I didn't think you'd be such a crybaby. His words hurt. I wasn't a crybaby. I was just scared of what was happening. No matter how many times we called, no one answered. In the end, he said he would take me himself. Unfortunately, we went back to the same way, and once again, he took me to the same alley. Along the way back, he taunted me. So you scared, huh? Now I'll show you. So you will learn to listen to me when I say something. His threats kept playing in my mind, making me cry even harder. He pushed me against the wall and I fell hard to the ground. At the moment, I wanted my mom. At least she didn't hit me. Sure, she said hurtful things, but she didn't hit me. He came towards me and lifted me by my hair. I was aching from the night before. He repeated what he had done before, and I experienced the same pain all over again. The alley was deserted, and most of the houses were abandoned. Out of fear, I couldn't make a sound, and no one noticed us. When we got home, my clothes were dirty and my hair was messy. My cheek was red, and when my mom saw me, she got a little scared. But Mr. Khiabani acted completely normal and smiled. He said, I'm so sorry, your kid slipped and hit the wall on the way here. I let go of her hand for just a second. She's so playful. She can't stay still. My mom frowned, and his words didn't ease her frown. She thanked him and dragged me inside the house. She looked at me with surprise, but I had a lump in my throat. Being back in our own home made me feel a little better, but I was still stressed about seeing Mr. Khiabani again. My mom turned me around and examined my whole body. How did you fall like that? Did Sohail bite you? The memory of last night terrified me again. I didn't know what to say. If I said it was Mr. Khiabani, he'd come after me again and worse things would happen to me for sure. She shook me and demanded an answer. When she got angry, I froze up even more. Out of desperation, I nodded yes, and she said, Could it be that Sohail did all this to you? I didn't say anything again. Poor Sohail. I locked myself in my room until night and didn't come out. My mom's only reaction was at that moment. After that, she didn't come near me again. It seemed like she got used to it. In the morning, when I tried to get up for school, a sharp pain shot through my body. When I put my feet on the floor, it felt like there was a rock inside me. I took a few steps, and the pain was still there, even worse. I got scared. I felt like it was because of what happened yesterday. If I reacted in front of my mom, she'd notice. But the pain was so intense that tears started to fall. I wiped my eyes and slowly peeked into the kitchen. I took small steps and walked with my legs apart. Unfortunately, as soon as my mom saw me, she knew I wasn't feeling well. Worried, she came towards me and checked my body again. This time, she was stressed and didn't yell. She kept asking what had happened and what was wrong. I was in so much pain that I finally spoke. Mom, my body burns. Her question shocked me. She asked, Don't you wash yourself after going to the bathroom? I said, I do. That day I didn't go to school and my mother believed that I wasn't cleaning myself properly. I stayed at home for a few days, and once, when Mr. Khiabani wanted to take me to his house again, my mom didn't let him and said that I wasn't feeling well. For the first time, I was happy. Because of my illness, I didn't see them for a long time, about a month. My mental state improved, but I kept having terrible nightmares. One night, when they came to our house again, I stayed close to my mom. No matter how much they asked me to play with Sohail, I didn't get up. In the end, my mom forced me into the room and Sohail followed us. We were playing together. When Sohail got up to go to the bathroom, I was afraid to be alone, especially with Mr. Khiabani in our house. Sohail took a long time to return and I started to feel anxious. Then Mr. Khiabani entered the room with a doll. As soon as I saw him, I started trembling again. But he smiled and approached me with endearing words while holding the doll. He handed the doll to me and when he was sure no one else was around, he placed me on his lap. I was motionless. He was about to make a move when Sohail came in. "Dad, what are you doing?" Mr. Khiabani quickly pulled away and I had tears in my eyes. Anyone could tell what was happening. He stood up, smiling, told Sohail that he had bought the doll for me and was just giving it to me. He left without saying anything further. Sohail looked at me with confusion and after that day, Mr. Khiabani didn't visit our house again. As I grew older, our connection with them lessened, but I stayed in touch with Sohail. When we were in middle school, they came to our house one night, and by then I had grown up. Khiabani couldn't do anything anymore. When I was a child, I was gullible, but as an adult, I was no longer vulnerable to him. Sohail took my number that day and we decided to stay in touch and talk occasionally. Gradually, our relationship became closer and he called me every night for a while. Over time, I felt myself developing feelings for Sohail. He was a good guy and whenever I needed him, he was there for me. The only thing that bothered me was his father. Although after a few years he probably thought I had forgotten everything because during my adulthood he visited our house again and he didn't even look at me. It seemed like only children mattered to him. But Sohail, he made me lose my logic. I didn't care whether his father was around or not. I wanted him. We stayed in touch through university and one day, my mom excitedly told me that Mr. Khiabani was coming to propose for his son. I was even more excited, but I was terrified of Sohail's father. The fear from my childhood still lingered inside me. That night when they came, Mr. Khiabani didn't look at me strangely anymore. Even when we were alone for a few minutes in their house, he didn't do anything and didn't even speak. I thought everything was fine now and that he wouldn't bother me anymore. Sohail and I got married and started our life together. My life with Sohail was going beautifully. One day when I was alone at home, the doorbell rang. I thought it was the neighbor. But as soon as I opened the door, I saw Khiabani. At first, I got scared, but then I thought that he wouldn't do anything to me anymore, and my fear disappeared. After all, he was my father-in-law, and it would be rude to treat him badly. It would be inappropriate for Sohail too. He said he just came to check on Sohail and see him. But I told him that Sohail was at work and would be home in about 4 hours. He asked, "May I come in and wake my son?" His tone was very serious. Without thinking, I stepped aside and let him in. My clothes were loose and I wasn't wearing a scarf, but there was no problem. Once inside, he inspected everything and I went to the kitchen to make tea. I told myself that If he touched me, I'd defend myself and kick him out. Then I laughed at my thoughts because Mr. Khiyabani had become less intrusive. And if he wanted to do something to me, he had had many opportunities by now. While I was pouring tea, I noticed he was standing behind me. The tray slipped from my hands and fell to the floor. My body froze again. All the thoughts I had about defending myself vanished. With his movements, my mind went blank, and the same feeling I had as a child returned. Suddenly, I snapped out of it. I grabbed his hand and pushed him away. I was crying and yelling at him, but he just laughed and said, "Your whole life is in my hands. Your family's life is in my hands. Do you really think I'm so foolish as to come at you without any leverage? If you speak up, I'll ruin your family's life. Everything you have is because of me. I could even take my son away from you, and then you and your mother would have to sleep on the streets. The house you live in is in my name, and your dad's car is mine. Do you think he could have bought that car with just a simple worker's salary? Have you forgotten how you lived before?" The way of his words was overwhelming. I couldn't understand all the details, but I was certain that Mr. Khiyabani was wealthy and could use his money for various purposes, including some actions that deeply affected me that night. After his comments, I felt overwhelmed and suffocated. It seemed he was trying to manipulate everything to his advantage. That day after his remarks, when he saw that I was silent, he came toward me again and repeated his actions. I was no longer a child who couldn't understand what was happening. He did as he pleased and then left. His visit wasn't about seeing his son. It was solely about his own agenda. When Sohail came home that night, I was much quieter than usual, reflecting on how my life seemed stuck in a repetitive cycle, with no way to change it. Even if my family weren't involved, Sohail might not have believed me. His father had a way of manipulating everything in his favor. A few days after the incident, Sohail's father started coming to our house every day, doing what he wanted and then leaving. My mental state was under significant strain. One day, when I needed medical attention, I didn't answer the door. Despite his repeated knocking, I stayed silent. About half an hour later, Sohail called me. I was anxious, fearing he might have shared the situation with others. But he said, "Dorsa, are you okay? My dad is at the door. Why aren't you opening it?" I was relieved to hear he hadn't mentioned anything. I responded nervously, I didn't hear." I hurried to the door, and when I opened it, I saw Sohail standing there. He hung up without a goodbye. It didn't matter much because his father, in a fit of anger, entered, and I felt overwhelmed. He tried to physically overpower me, but I resisted as much as I could. Eventually, in his frustration, he dragged me to the room, trying to keep my cries from alerting the neighbors. In the room, he continued his actions. I cried and pleaded with him to stop, but he grew more aggressive and unpredictable. In the end, Sohail came to my rescue. He loudly confronted his father and intervened. Mr. Khiyabani seemed to realize the seriousness of the situation, but was unable to continue after Sohail's intervention. I pulled back, crying, and watched the struggle. During the confrontation, Sohail expressed his frustration. "I knew it. I knew everything from a young age. Your true nature became clear to me then." I wasn't sure which day he was referring to, but Mr. Khiyabani left the house. Sohail sat down with me and asked various questions, such as how long his father had been coming to our house and how long he had been inappropriate with me. I described everything with significant censorship. That night didn't end well, and Sohail became somehow distant. Bill lost contact with his family, and he didn't even call his mother. When I suggested he should at least call his mother, he would say, "She's just like my father." Yet, Mrs. Parastu seemed like a good person, and I didn't know why he felt that way. Mr. Khiabani and his wife were no longer around us, and he didn't act on any of his threats, leaving us alone. Years have passed since then, and the only person who stood by me through these difficulties was Sohail. Despite his initial distance, I will never forget that he was the only one who believed in me and listened to me. He took on responsibilities that my own family should have. That day, I promised myself that when I have children, I will never take my eyes off them and will be so close that they will share all their thoughts with me.